Good evening, seekers of truth, keepers of legacy, and listeners who crave the stories beneath the thunderous roar of revolution, the voices often unheard but shaping the foundations of nations. I am the Duke of New York, and you're listening to Faces of History, where we peel back the layers of time to reveal the men and women whose ideas, courage, and contradictions form the very bedrock of our world. Tonight, we step into the life of a man often overshadowed by giants, a man whose pen wielded power equal to muskets and cannons. John Dickinson, a lawyer, a politician, a thinker, a man known as the Penman of the Revolution. He wrote words that stirred a colony toward independence, and yet hesitated when the time came to draw the sword. Tonight, we explore the life of a man torn between loyalty and liberty, a patriot who shaped a nation but remained haunted by the price of war. Welcome to Faces of History, John Dickinson, Fuarken. Before John Dickinson's ink could stir revolutions and shape constitutions, he was simply a boy, born not in the cobbled heart of London, but among the marshlands and plantations of Colonial Maryland. He was born on November 8, 1732, on his family's plantation near Trapp, Talbot County. The Dickinsons were no common settlers scratching out a life in the raw wilderness. They were landowners, wealthy planters, people of privilege in a world built on tobacco, trade, and enslaved labor. His father, Samuel Dickinson, was ambitious and prosperous, a man who understood the power of land and law. His mother, Mary Cadwallader, belonged to a prominent Quaker family from Pennsylvania, people who prized education, community, and the quiet courage of conscience. These two worlds, the wealth and authority of landed gentry and the introspective, disciplined faith of the Quakers, shaped young John's early years. Even as a child, he was taught that words mattered, that knowledge was a duty, and that the affairs of men and empires were not just the business of kings, but of any citizen with the mind to question them. When John was just 7 years old, the family moved north to Delaware, settling near Dover on Poplar Hall, a sprawling plantation that Samuel Dickinson had purchased. There, amid fertile fields and legal ledgers, John's education began in earnest. Tutors and private instruction filled his days: Latin, Greek, history, philosophy, the law. He was a quiet child, thoughtful and observant, the kind who would sit near the fireplace with a thick book rather than join rowdy games outdoors. He learned early to measure his words, to weigh an argument, to see the difference between rash passion and reasoned conviction. His Quaker roots gave him a deep moral sense, a belief that conscience was not just personal, but political. Yet he also grew up in a world where his family's prosperity rested on an economy bound to slavery, a contradiction that would shadow his conscience for years to come. At 18, John crossed the Atlantic, not to fight for a crown or colony, but to study the law at London's prestigious Middle Temple. There, the young American from Delaware rubbed shoulders with England's future barristers, politicians, and judges. He immersed himself in the traditions and precedents of British law, Magna Carta, common law, the rights of Englishmen. This was no empty ritual. In those candlelit halls, Dickinson's belief in the power of words deepened. He saw how parliaments and kings clashed over the limits of power, how arguments written on parchment could move armies or break thrones. London's streets showed him a world bustling with trade and ambition, but also riddled with inequality. He read the fiery pamphlets of radicals and the measured prose of cautious reformers. He came to understand that liberty could be demanded by the pen and defended, if necessary, by force. But even then, John Dickinson recoiled from violence. He believed change must be earned through reason first, through appeals to justice, through the careful construction of laws that outlast gunpowder and muskets. When he returned to America in 1757, John Dickinson was no longer just a planter's son. He was a trained lawyer, a man with one foot in the colonial soil and the other in the traditions of British law. He brought with him a mind sharpened by English debates and a spirit that burned for fair governance. He set up practice in Philadelphia, the intellectual and political heart of the colonies, and quickly earned a reputation for brilliance and integrity. He was not loud. He was not charismatic in the manner of Patrick Henry or Samuel Adams. But when John Dickinson spoke, people listened because he argued with precision and wrote with clarity that cut through the noise of rebellion and fear. So here was a man forged in two worlds, colonial fields, and English courts. A man who cherished the rights of Englishmen, but began to see that those rights could not be truly protected while Parliament taxed and ruled an ocean away. A man who loved peace, but would spend his life torn over how far a people must go to claim their freedom. Next, we see how that quiet, bookish boy, the child of Quakers and planters, English judges and American fields, would take up his pen and find his voice, writing words that would rattle the foundations of an empire. Stay with me. When John Dickinson stepped back onto American soil after his years in London, he did not return as a firebrand ready to light torches in the streets. He returned armed with a quill and the unshakable belief that ideas, when wielded precisely, could be mightier than any musket. Philadelphia in the mid-1700s was a city alive with whispers of rebellion and the murmur of dangerous ideas. Coffee houses and taverns hummed with talk of liberty, taxes, and distant kings who knew little of the daily life of farmers, merchants, and tradesmen in the colonies. Dickinson quickly rose among this ferment. He established himself as a brilliant lawyer, but it was not in courtrooms where he would first make his mark on the American mind. It was on the page. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a tax that demanded colonists pay for a stamp on every piece of paper they used: newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. To London, it was a reasonable way to cover the debts of empire. To the colonies, it was an insult, taxation without representation. The colonies erupted in protest. Dickinson found himself torn, a man loyal to the British Constitution, yet outraged at what he saw as its betrayal. He spoke out in Pennsylvania's Assembly and at the Stamp Act Congress in New York, urging unity, urging calm, urging the power of words and petitions over violence in the streets. When the Stamp Act was repealed, Dickinson felt vindicated, but victory was short-lived. Parliament would not be deterred. In 1767, the Townshend Acts arrived, new duties on glass, paper, lead, paint, and tea. Another slap in the face, another test of colonial resolve. It was here that Dickinson's voice rose above the din. He sat down at his desk, candle flickering into the night, and wrote what would become his most famous work, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Published anonymously between 1767 and 1768 in newspapers throughout the colonies, these 12 letters were written not with the rage of a radical, but with the calm, clear logic of a country lawyer. A farmer, he called himself, though he was far more than that. In these letters, Dickinson argued that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies for revenue. He did not reject British authority outright. He called himself a loyal subject, but he demanded that any taxes imposed must be with the consent of those being taxed. Representation, he wrote, was not a gift from the crown. It was a right inherited by Englishmen and transplanted across the Atlantic with every colonist who dared to settle new land. What made these letters powerful was not their radicalism. It was their reasonableness. Dickinson's words united the moderate merchant, the skeptical planter, and the everyday tradesman who might otherwise have shied from street protests. He spoke their language, the plain voice of a farmer who tended his fields, yet knew that liberty was the true harvest worth fighting for. We cannot be happy without being free. We cannot be free without being secure in our property, he wrote. Simple, direct, undeniable. His letters spread like sparks carried on the wind, reprinted in New York, Boston, Charleston, even London. His arguments found their way into the hands of tavern keepers and ship captains, planters, and cobblers. Here was no Samuel Adams rallying mobs. Here was John Dickinson rallying minds. But make no mistake, Dickinson's pen was not timid. It called for colonial unity when unity was fragile. It called for non-importation agreements, organized boycotts of British goods. He knew that the purse could be as mighty as the sword when wielded by many. He warned that if the colonies submitted to this taxation, they would open the door to endless abuses of power. He made people see that freedom, once lost in the details of tariffs and duties, would slip away without a shot being fired. Yet even as he stoked the fires of resistance, Dickinson dreaded the blaze of outright rebellion. His loyalty to the crown was not blind, but it was sincere. He believed that reconciliation and reform could still win the day. That protest could bring Parliament to its senses. That reason could bind empire and colony together again. He did not yet see that the tide had turned. that for many, his careful words were the first steps on a road that could end only in war. But history rarely asks permission. As his letters from a farmer circulated, they turned Dickinson into a symbol, the penman of the Revolution. He would attend the First Continental Congress, help craft petitions to the king, draft declarations of colonial rights, always pushing for unity, always hoping to avert the chaos he feared. And yet, as the thunderclouds of war gathered overhead, Dickinson would soon find himself in a lonely place. Next, we follow the penman into the crucible of revolution, where words collide with muskets and where John Dickinson must choose whether his pen alone is enough to stand against tyranny. Stay with me. By the early 1770s, the wind was shifting. Protest songs turned to battle hymns. Boycotts became militias. Parchment petitions gave way to hidden muskets stored in barns and church lofts. For years, John Dickinson's pen had held back the tide. His letters from a farmer stitched together angry colonies into a single cloth of protest. His voice rang out in the First Continental Congress in 1774, where he drafted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances that demanded the king hear the colony's pleas for fair treatment. In these words, Dickinson still hoped for peace, for reason to prevail. He did not see disloyalty in standing up to Parliament. Rather, he saw loyalty to the true principles of English law: no taxation without representation, no tyranny without challenge. But across the Atlantic, the king's ministers answered with new restrictions, new soldiers, new taxes, and no apologies. The Boston Tea Party turned harbor waters black with leaf and rebellion. The coercive acts, what the colonies called the Intolerable Acts, followed swiftly, slamming the door on negotiation. In this boiling cauldron, Dickinson stood in Philadelphia's grand halls, quill in hand, surrounded by men who spoke not of petitions, but of powder and shot. Yet Dickinson could not simply let go of his hope for reconciliation. He believed it was not yet too late to reach the king's ear, and to remind him that these were not rebels, but loyal subjects defending ancient English liberties. In May 1775, shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, the first blood drawn. Dickinson, torn by duty and dread, drafted the Olive Branch Petition, a final plea to George III to halt the march toward civil war. He begged for dialogue, compromise, mercy. But the king by then saw only sedition. He rejected the petition, declared the colonies in rebellion, and sent more ships, more redcoats, more orders to crush this rising fire across the sea. And so the Second Continental Congress turned its gaze to independence, a break once unthinkable. In 1776, the time came to declare it to the world. Thomas Jefferson, young and fiery, took the quill Dickinson once wielded and wrote words that would echo for centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Yet when the moment came to vote, John Dickinson, the penman who had done so much to light the path here, could not bring himself to sign. It was not cowardice. It was not betrayal. For Dickinson, it was conscience. He argued that the colonies were not yet ready, that the Articles of Confederation were unfinished, that the army was ill-prepared, that independence declared too soon would bring only ruin. He feared a fractured rebellion, a failed war, a colony left in chaos without the very unity he had so carefully stitched together. His refusal was not taken kindly by all. He was denounced by some as timid, cautious to a fault, a man out of step with the thundering call for liberty. His own words, once a rallying cry, now branded him hesitant. Yet history rarely leaves us in neat boxes of hero and traitor. Dickinson knew that if war must come, he would not watch from a safe distance. When the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, John Dickinson did not run to England, nor retreat to his plantations. He put down his pen and picked up a musket. The Duke of New York, in 1777, at the age of 45, older than many soldiers under his command, Dickinson donned the uniform of a brigadier general in the Pennsylvania militia. He led troops into New Jersey to defend against British advances, his quill now replaced by a saber at his side. He did what his conscience demanded. If the colonies would fight, he would fight too. If blood must be shed, he would share in that burden. If independence must be paid for in sacrifice, he would pay his share. So here we see John Dickinson, a man torn not by fear but by duty to peace and principle alike, a man who never confused caution with cowardice or compromise with surrender, a man who believed the pen should always write before the sword could swing, but when words failed, he he did not flinch from the battlefield either. Next, we follow Dickinson from the smoky haze of muskets back into the halls of government, where his quiet wisdom would help write the fragile beginnings of America's first attempt at self-government. Stay with me. By the time the smoke cleared from the battlefields of the Revolution, the United States of America, so boldly proclaimed, was a newborn still gasping for breath. Independence had been won in blood, but governance was another battlefield altogether. John Dickinson, the man once derided for caution, returned to the work he did best, shaping nations with words, logic, and pen strokes. Many called him the Penman of the Revolution, but history might better remember him as the architect of the Confederation. For it was Dickinson's careful mind that laid the first fragile framework for these unruly states to live together under a single roof. In 1776, even before the last British regiments had left American shores, Congress needed a plan, a blueprint to bind 13 fiercely independent colonies into one political body. Who could craft it? Who had the patience, the caution, the talent for compromise to hold this new experiment together? They turned to John Dickinson. In a quiet room in Philadelphia, Dickinson drafted what became the Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution before the Constitution. It was not perfect, it was not powerful, but it was necessary. Dickinson knew the colonies distrusted central authority. They had just thrown off the world's mightiest king, after all. So his articles leaned toward caution. Each state retained its sovereignty, its independence, its power. Congress could make decisions, but not easily enforce them. There was no strong executive, no federal judiciary, no power to tax. To modernize, it seems timid, but to Dickinson, it was the only arrangement the colonies would accept. Better to have a weak union than none at all. Better to begin the work than to tear the fragile threads apart before the experiment could even take its first breath. In 1777, the Articles were adopted, a slow, clumsy, but vital step toward forging the United States. For 5 chaotic years of war and early peace, they held the new nation together like a patchwork quilt, frayed at the edges but warm enough to keep the states from freezing into isolation. But Dickinson did not stop there. He believed America needed more than mere words on parchment. It needed ideas that would survive the clash of factions and the temptations of power. So he kept writing. He served in the Delaware Assembly. He served as president, yes, president of Delaware and later Pennsylvania, guiding his home states through the turbulent birth pains of independence. And when the Articles began to buckle under the weight of debt, infighting, and disunity, Dickinson once again stepped forward. He was not in Philadelphia for the whole Constitutional Convention in 1787, but he was there at its fragile dawn. He sent his thoughts, his warnings, his essays. He argued for balance, a strong enough central government to bind the states, but one held in check by reason, law, and the people's rights. One of his greatest legacies came in the form of 2 words, "We the people." The preamble to the Constitution is credited to Gouverneur Morris's pen, but the seeds of its vision can be traced to the early drafts and principles that Dickinson championed. The radical belief that a government's legitimacy flows from its citizens, not the whims of kings or the accidents of birth. Dickinson supported the new Constitution, but demanded that it be protected by a Bill of Rights. Explicit protections for freedom of speech, religion, assembly. He believed deeply that liberty must be spelled out plainly, not left to the goodwill of future rulers. When Delaware became the first state to ratify the Constitution, it did so under Dickinson's watchful eye. He was president of its Constitutional Convention, guiding his state to lead the way for the union he dreamed of for decades. He was no fiery Patrick Henry, no sword-waving Alexander Hamilton, no soaring orator like Jefferson. He was the drafter, the reviser, the patient weaver of words who stitched 13 quarrelsome colonies into a single patchwork republic, fragile, flawed, yet enduring. His work did not win him statues on every green or fireworks on every 4th of July, but it lives in the quiet lines of our charters and the cautious checks in our government's bones. His pen shaped the framework that even now holds the world's oldest living democracy together, a nation forever wrestling with the same tensions Dickinson knew too well: freedom and unity, dissent and duty, caution and courage. Next, we see how this gentle architect spent his final years, and how His quiet wisdom continues to echo through every debate about who we are and what we owe to each other as one people. Stay with me. When the roar of muskets faded and the ink of the Constitution dried, America stepped uncertainly into its fragile new life, and John Dickinson, the man who had steered it through so many storms with his pen, stepped back into quieter shadows. In the final chapters of his life, Dickinson did not seek power or public glory. He sought only to live according to the principles he had bled onto parchment: reason, moderation, and the moral responsibility of the citizen to the common good. After the Constitution was ratified, with Delaware, his adopted state, the first to sign its name in bold, Dickinson did not retire in name alone. He returned to private life at Poplar Hall, his estate near Dover, Delaware. The grand debates of Philadelphia's State House gave way to the quieter debates within his own mind of how to reconcile his enduring Quaker beliefs with the violence that had forged the nation he loved so deeply. Though Dickens had never formally converted, the Quaker plainness had soaked into his marrow. He wore simple clothes, managed his lands with a fair and measured hand, and freed the enslaved people he inherited, an act that, in his time and place, made him both praised and scorned. Even after a lifetime of wealth, position, and privilege, Dickinson's conscience would not allow him to ignore the contradictions between liberty on paper and bondage in his own fields. In his will, he made his wishes clear. Any people enslaved on his land were to be freed. For a man born into the gentry of Maryland's tobacco world, this was not a symbolic gesture. It was a deliberate act of faith, a final alignment of deeds with words. The Duke of New York. But retirement did not mean silence. Dickinson wrote essays on politics and law well into his last years. He published arguments urging Americans to guard their new Constitution like a flickering flame, warning that corruption, partisanship, and greed could snuff out the hard-won freedoms if citizens failed to hold their leaders accountable. He worried about the emerging split between North and South, about the easy slide into factions and the temptation of strong men to grab power under the banner of liberty. He reminded those who would listen that democracy is not a gift you inherit once, but a duty you tend every generation. And yet, even as the world changed around him, new towns springing up, new settlers pushing west, new battles for control of commerce and territory, Dickinson remained steadfastly old-fashioned. He believed deeply in compromise, in debate over violence, in the patient power of thoughtful words. To many younger revolutionaries, now drunk on the thrill of independence, he seemed a relic, the cautious moderate who almost held them back. But history knows that revolutions, once won, must be governed. And it was Dickinson's calm, steady hand that taught a young republic how to stand on its own feet without devouring itself. John Dickinson died in 1808 at the age of 75. No roaring cannons, no mourning crowds lining the streets, only a quiet burial near his home in Wilmington, Delaware. He left behind no vast monument, no marble obelisk. Instead, he left words, pages and pages of them. The letters from a farmer, the Articles of Confederation, his drafts of petitions, his amendments, his private letters of warning and hope. He left an idea that freedom is precious not because it gives us license to do as we wish, but because it binds us to a responsibility to each other. That the pen can steady the hand that holds the sword, and that liberty, if it is to last, must always be defended first with words, then with ballots, and only lastly with blood. And so tonight, we remember John Dickinson, not as a hero cast in iron or bronze, but as something rarer, a man of conviction who refused to be forced into easy boxes. He was loyal, yet rebellious, cautious, yet brave. He spoke when others shouted, and in his quiet reason, he helped lay the foundation that even now holds this messy, fragile experiment we call America. His legacy is not a single phrase carved in stone, but a question he asked, again and again, that still echoes today. How do we remain free, yet united? When the fires of revolution burn too bright, we need voices like Dickinson's to remind us that liberty is not just the right to fight, but the duty to listen, to write, to think, and to hold fast to the better angels of our nature. So, the next time you pass a ballot box, a courtroom, a library of law, think of the man in the shadows behind the parchment, the penman of the revolution, the cautious patriot, the architect of American compromise, John Dickinson. John Dickinson's life is a lesson in the complexities of revolution, a reminder that history is not only made by the loudest voices, but also by those who seek balance amid chaos. He stood for justice, for unity, for cautious progress, even when the tide demanded extremes. In an age where the choices seem absolute, Dickinson's story whispers that sometimes the bravest thing is to wrestle with doubt, to write words that last longer than bullets, and to serve a nation while questioning the cost. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. I am the Duke of New York, and you've been listening to Faces of History. Until next time, keep questioning, keep remembering, and look closely at the faces of history, for in them you may see your own reflection. Good night.